Chuck Hegner was the victim of state-sponsored terror.
When these terrorists killed my husband, they threw my life into quicksand.
Miriam Lewin was the victim of state terror.
I can't understand how someone can kiss his wife and his children goodbye in the morning and then apply electric shocks to someone else's vagina.
Duane Claridge ordered acts of terror on behalf of his government.
Hitting a ship with a firecracker mine is terrorism. I would call it war.
We expect our leaders to protect, not terrorize us. And we have a right to expect governments to observe the law, not support the lawless. So what happens when the state breaks its bond of trust with its citizens and becomes a terrorist itself, or sponsors others in acts of terror? Arlington National Cemetery in Washington, D.C. The final resting place for America's fallen heroes, and also of American victims of terrorism around the globe. The Hegner family have gathered from around the United States for the first time in 17 years to pay tribute to one such man. Chuck Hegner wasn't a soldier, and he wasn't a politician. He was an accountant.
Hi, Chuck. I'm back.
These are ordinary working Americans, trying to get by, trying to make sense of a world that crashed in on them all those years ago.
We've missed you every minute of the time you've been gone. He just adored you. I just hope that he's able to see you and to know that you're here. Chuck, I've needed you so many times. I had no one else to turn to.
On the night of December the 3rd, 1984, Chuck Hegner boarded Kuwait Airlines Flight 221 from Kuwait City to Karachi, Pakistan. Following a brief stopover in Dubai, the plane was hijacked by 4 terrorists who ordered the British captain to fly north to Iran.
They asked the Americans to come forward, and my husband was the only one that went up to the front of the plane. Now, the captain said he turned around and he saw my husband on his knees, and he had his hands in a position as if he were praying, and he said, Captain Clark said he had to turn his face away because he couldn't stand to see the fear that was in my husband's eyes. They shot him in the shoulder, and then they shot him in the neck and in the head. And then they just threw him out onto the tarmac.
Chuck Hegner's murderers were members of the Hezbollah terrorist group and were demanding the release of 4 of their comrades held captive in Kuwait. Hegner was the first to die at their hands. Then his colleague William Stanford was killed as part of a 6-day orgy of torture and murder.
I don't see a time where it's going to get easier.
You want to know what I'm thinking? But I had planned to grow old with him. After he died, I tried very hard to be strong. And the more I tried to get on with life, the worse it got. And 10 months after he died, I ended up in a psychiatric institute. I just couldn't accept that something so horrible could happen to such a nice family.
They gave Chuck Hegner a hero's welcome and President Reagan sent a letter of condolence, and Vice President Bush spoke with feeling.
On behalf of our president and all Americans, we mourn the loss of Chuck Hegna and Bill Stanford. These two were husbands and fathers, good and decent men.
But the family have to this day not had justice or compensation for the loss of Chuck. What they do now know is that his death in Tehran was not just the result of a terrible terrorist act, but that the terrorists were being underwritten by the very state on whose soil the murder took place, Iran. Since overthrowing the Shah in 1979, the Islamic regime of Iran has been a persistent sponsor of terror beyond its borders, in particular through Hezbollah, which it uses to destabilize regimes and attack American and other Western targets. Presented with this evidence, on January the 18th, 2002, federal judge Henry Kennedy ordered Iran to pay the Hegna family $42 million in damages and a further $333 million in punitive damages. Iran has not responded to the charges or the judgment, but continues to support and supply Hezbollah and a number of other terrorist groups.
State-sponsored terrorism tends to be one of the more dangerous forms of terrorism, precisely because the terrorist organizations enjoying the largesse, whether it's money, operational funds, intelligence assistance, logistic, or training, tend to be just more formidable enemies. They tend to be far more capable. They assume the attributes almost of an established nation's commando or elite strike force, because basically that's what they are. They're being trained now by an established nation state and having all these benefits of waging war. So their ability to punch above their weight is that much greater.
Iran, Iraq, Libya, and the recently deposed Taliban regime. They're all sponsors of terror. But no surprises there, really, for the actions of these countries have been widely reported. But state support of terror has also taken place nearer to home. And though now largely forgotten, it shows that even democratic governments can get drawn in. Meet the Contras, an army founded, funded, and armed by a foreign government. An army that punched way above its weight as it committed atrocities in its own country for 7 years in an undeclared war supported by a group of foreigners opposed to the government of Nicaragua. Those foreigners were the American President, Ronald Reagan, the Vice President, George Bush, and their closest advisors. In 1978, discontent against the corrupt pro-American regime of President Anastasio Somoza in Nicaragua exploded into general insurrection. By 1979, the American public and President Carter finally lost all sympathy for Somoza when his National Guard soldiers executed an American reporter on camera. Within a month, Somoza had fled, and the opposition Sandinistas, led by Daniel Ortega, swept to power. In America, President Carter welcomed the change, but not everyone agreed.
When the Sandinistas came to power, the intelligence establishment were largely appalled. There was a way to have saved the whole Nicaraguan problem and get rid of Somoza without having the Sandinistas come to power, and that had been ignored by the Carter administration. We could easily get rid of Somoza. We had the power to do that, and with the rest of his cronies. And we could have gone in there and basically taken over the National Guard and reconstituted it, and you know, through the political parties in Nicaragua, organized elections.
By 1981, there was a new president in the White House, and he was much more sympathetic to the cold warriors in the intelligence establishment. Ronald Reagan appointed William Casey as head of the CIA, and Casey took immediate steps to implement a new policy on Nicaragua.
Casey said, take 3 weeks off and just look at what we should do in Central America and come back and tell me what to do. Well, it only took about, 3 days to figure out what to do. We should take the war to Nicaragua.
To take his war to Nicaragua, Duane Clarridge set up an office in the United States Embassy in neighboring Honduras. The richest nation on earth was about to sponsor an insurgency against one of the poorest peoples on the planet.
As I said, we needed to establish an insurgency. Well, you have to have somebody to do that with. And there were about 500 ragtag people running around, Nicaraguans, running around the Honduran-Nicaraguan border.
Under Claridge's guidance, this ragtag group became known as the FDN, the Nicaraguan Democratic Forces, more commonly called the Contras. President Reagan liked to present the Contras as a genuine organization of freedom fighters.
I've spoken recently of the freedom fighters of Nicaragua. They are the moral equal of our founding fathers and the brave men and women of the French resistance. We cannot turn away from them.
The Sandinista rule is a communist reign of terror. You see, when the Sandinistas betrayed the revolution, many who had fought the old Somoza dictatorship literally took to the hills and began fighting the Soviet bloc communists and their Nicaraguan collaborators. These few have now been joined by thousands.
Nicaragua was a hands-on war. The U.S. government, through CIA, was involved day to day in the war effort, either in training, guiding, crewing ships, whatever, and in the political process of the Contra movement, which was significant.
President Reagan had created a private Central American army, run for him by Duane Clarridge of the CIA, and as is now well known, armed with weapons secretly purchased from America's Middle East enemy, Iran. So what did Clarridge tell his army to do?
We took a position and insisted on this position with the Contra leadership that they not hit economic targets. But in about 1983, I came to the conclusion that we were probably binding our hands too closely. And therefore, we shifted to economic targets.
By shifting to economic targets, as he puts it, Clarridge was setting his forces on a headlong course that was ultimately found in the World Court to be in contravention of international law and was destined to become outright terror. He was going to hit Nicaragua's oil imports, as well as her only deep-water port, Corinto.
So we decided we had to have a Navy. We went down to Miami and got the U.S. Customs Service to give us 2 of these fast cigarette boats that they had confiscated from drug smugglers. And we got these for nothing. And then we rebuilt these boats so they could carry a 25-millimeter chain gun in the bow and a 40-millimeter grenade launcher in the rear. Then we took an oil service ship that had a long rear deck and built 2 hydraulic rams under the deck that you could put the 2 boats up under. So during the day, this service ship could go up and down the coast looking like a service ship, concealing the 2 cigarette boats underneath. And at night, we could put 3 Hughes 500 helicopters on the deck, armed with a minigun and 2.75 rockets. The boat operators and the pilots were Latin American. They were basically on contract to CIA.
After a series of failed exercises, Clarridge decided to set his navy a new target. His men would take out Corinto's only crane and render the port unusable. The plan worked beyond his wildest dreams.
2 Q-boats came up the channel, came up near the port facility, ran aground, and were cheered on by the people sitting on the pier who thought they were their boats and shot out the crane, went up a little estuary to turn around, and as they were coming back around, and this was not in their terms of engagement, all the oil tanks for Corinto were sitting on the left-hand shore. And they engaged them, and they all went up.
Were you proud of them?
Yes, I was very proud of them. Nobody had died on either side. Our policy was to keep casualties to a minimum.
Corinto's oil tanks burnt for 2 days, bringing fear and terror to the town and its people, all of whom had to be evacuated for their safety.
Lo que yo me acuerdo es que nosotros
What I remember is that we came outside shouting and crying. We came out of the house naked, only in knickers. We were running, and I remember asking for my daddy because he was working at the docks. And they put us on a bus, because they were only putting women and children on the buses. And we were crying. All around us, people were crying and shouting in desperation.
Successful as this operation was, Claridge's Washington masters wanted an even more high-profile campaign.
In January of 1984, at a meeting of the National Security Planning Group with Reagan in the chair, all the players in foreign policy were there. They asked me to increase the number of guerrillas. And we were approaching 3,500. Adding another 1,000, 2,000 wasn't going to accomplish anything. So I was sitting at home late January thinking about this, actually having a martini and smoking cigars. And it occurred to me that maybe we ought to mine Corinto and the anchorage for the oil resupply and some of the smaller ports on the Atlantic coast.
They
were good-sized mines with around 30 to 40 kilos of explosives in them. They could lift a fishing boat weighing 120 tons up to 1 meter off the sea surface, and then bring it straight back down to sink it.
These were mines built by CIA itself in its own, body shop. We began to hit ships. We hit a Soviet tanker badly, even hit a British ship, and slowly the shipping began to disappear from Corinto.
But hang on, Duane, we've just hit a Russian ship, we've hit a British ship, we've hit 1 or 2 other international ships. That's terrorism, isn't it?
Hitting a ship with a firecracker mine is terrorism? I would call it war.
It
wasn't just the Russian ship and the British one. There were numerous ships from lots of countries, including one time when we had to rescue 2 or 3 crew members from one ship because they'd been injured by an explosion. These ships were carrying food. Were bringing rice, sugar, and beans. In other words, food supplies for the population. That was all that they were carrying.
By 1984, the Contra's American-run campaign of economic terror and its human consequences was beginning to cause dismay worldwide, including the United States. One such critic was himself a former director of the CIA.
My concern is that it puts us in the position of being a state that sponsors terrorism. After all, if you're a ship captain from a third country, say Liberia, taking a ship into Corinto, Nicaragua during the mining period, and you're damaged or your life is endangered, you ask yourself, who did this? Well, it was the United States who sponsored it, and it's a terrorist act.
If you call that terrorism, then you're broadening the word terrorism out to normal warfare or insurgencies or whatever. To me, terrorism is aimed against civilians as a primary target.
Sadly, it was ordinary Nicaraguan civilians who were all too often the target of the Contras' terror. 5 days before Christmas in 1987, the Contras came here, to Ciuna on Nicaragua's northeast frontier, a peasant community of a few thousand souls. They took over the town for 24 hours and left more than 100 dead. After that, they regularly mined the only road into and out of town, inevitably killing the locals going about their business. And there are still mines here today. The people of Ciuna were not particularly supportive of either side in the war, but they, like so many others, became victims of Ronald Reagan's Contras.
Mi hijo estaba estudiando en Puerto, becado y...
My son was studying at the time in Puerto. He was on a scholarship. After he'd been there for about a month, he came back home for a holiday.
Entonces salió la contra la carretera.
On the way back after the holidays, the Contras stopped his bus about 15 kilometers from here. They let all the women go free, then they took all the men over the mountains into Honduras.
Rumbo a Honduras. Entonces allá estuvieron, allá lo llevaron a los campamentos.
Once they got there, they took all the people to camps and began to train them. They turned them into soldiers for the Contras.
Para la contra.
Particularmente conocimos de muertes, de asesinatos.
During the war, there were killings, assassinations, kidnappings, the raping of women, and they even murdered children. If they were fighting for freedom, then they did it with an excessive and disproportionate use of violence.
Provocando, en definitiva, daños.
They have dismembered people while they're alive. They've skinned them alive. They have cut out their tongues. They have cut off their genitals. They have slit women's stomachs, taken out the fetus if they're pregnant. It's really horrible.
This manual was given to Contra trainees by Duane Claridge's CIA men. It's a guide to psychological warfare and advocates assassination and murder. Some would call it a terrorist's handbook. And it is based on manuals which were standard issue for students at the School of the Americas here at Fort Benning, Georgia, in the southern United States. The school, now renamed the Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation, is a Pentagon operation and is paid for by American taxpayers.
De paz, libertad y éxito de esta gran nación. Salud!
Every year, roughly 2,000 of the elite officers of Latin America's armed forces are trained here in counterinsurgency, military intelligence, psychological warfare, and other dark arts.
The problem that we have in this village is that there are some guerrillas and there are some civilian, innocent people. And the students must be able to distinguish which are the guerrillas and which are the good guys. Initially, we have to treat everybody as a suspected enemy.
If you look at the course ranges that are offered to these individuals, they in fact are a dedicated way of teaching military leaders in foreign nations how to subvert their local communities.
The roll call of Latin American dictators and assassins who are old boys of the school is impressive. From Panama and El Salvador in the north to Chile and Argentina in the south. For death seems to follow the school's graduates home, and nowhere more so than here in Argentina. Argentine dictators, Generals Viola and Galtieri, were both trained at the School of Americas, like hundreds of other Argentine officers. These men presided over a reign of terror as they kidnapped, tortured, and murdered tens of thousands of Argentinians during the years of the so-called Dirty War in the 1970s and 80s. Today, behind the facade of this anonymous building in a suburb of Buenos Aires, a small part of the gruesome legacy of the Dirty War is filed for the future.
We're looking to around 340 boxes containing each of them a human skeleton. These skeletons are coming from several mass graves we discovered 10 years ago in a cemetery outside Buenos Aires. Most of them are part of a population of disappeared people who were killed in between 1976 and 1978.
This was once a young man in his 20s, shot twice through the head at point-blank range, probably while on his knees. A victim of state terror. In March 1976, Argentina's fragile democracy collapsed, and following the 6th successful coup of the 20th century, a military junta of the three armed forces took over the government.
Como si la voluntad de Dios quisiera demostrar sobre estas tierras de cuánto es capaz el ejército argentino cuando lucha por la libertad, la paz y la justicia para su pueblo.
Claiming that the country was under assault from subversive elements, what followed in the next 7.5 years was an unprecedented campaign of terror by the very institutions that were meant to protect the people.
Hombres de armas, hombres que vestían uniformes.
Military men were well-rounded human beings and respected the values of the Western world and all religions, turned their back on all these values and implemented a system that can only be described as state terrorism.
Dejaron de lado todo eso e implantaron un terrorismo de Estado criminal.
By doing this, they discarded all legal, ethical, moral and religious decency.
Moral y religioso.
Well, the day I was kidnapped by the Air Force, they took me to a place I could not identify. They tied me up, naked, on a table, and then they started torturing me using electric shocks in my mouth, all over my body, my breasts, my vagina, my eyes. They were throwing water on me, and then they also use what they call dry submarine, which is put in a plastic bag on your head, and they were yelling at me, beating me up. It was kind of diabolic.
Miriam Lewin was a 19-year-old factory secretary when she was kidnapped in Buenos Aires in 1977. Miriam was a supporter of the leftist group called the Montoneros. Some of its members used terror and violence. Many, like Miriam, simply wanted social justice in their country. After being held for nearly a year by the Argentine Air Force at an unknown torture center, Miriam Lewin was transferred here, the School of Naval Mechanics, or ESMA, in Buenos Aires. She was to be kept prisoner at the ESMA for another year, but she was one of the lucky ones.
At the School of Naval Mechanics, in what they call the basement, they had room 13. This room was the place where they tortured people with electric shocks. While they were torturing people, we worked nearby. You had to pretend that the screams did not affect you. If you showed that you were affected by torture, that would be a sign that you were not recovered for society, and they would transfer you as well. They would kill you.
At the ESMA, the Argentine torturers participated in an unimaginable plot which gave a new and horrible twist to their brand of state-sanctioned terror.
Many of my comrades were pregnant when they were arrested. They kept them alive allowed them to give birth to their children, and then the military took away the babies. They usually gave them away to military families who could not have children of their own.
Did you know any of the people that this happened to?
Yes, while I was at the ESMA, I met inside Patricia Reusenblit. She was almost 9 months pregnant, and we were friends from the outside. She had been kidnapped with her husband, also by the Air Force, and then taken to the ESMA just to give birth to her baby. She had a baby boy. I witnessed the delivery. I saw the doctor cutting the cord and putting the baby on her chest. She was radiant. She chose the name of Rodolfo for the baby boy. After a few days, they took her away, and they took away the baby.
Patricia Reusenblit was 25. She has never been seen since, but she is just one of hundreds of pregnant women who disappeared in Argentina during the Dirty War. These are the mothers of those disappeared women, the grandmothers of the unseen babies. Their organization, the Grandmothers of the May Square, has been campaigning for 25 years to find their children and their grandchildren.
El dolor más grande de una madre es la desaparición y muerte.
The most painful thing for a mother to suffer is the disappearance and death of a child. In our case, the case of the grandmothers, we also have to suffer another hardship, the loss of a grandchild and the child of our son or daughter. I think that the most frustrating thing, apart from the pain, is the uncertainty, not knowing. We don't know where our children are, and we don't know where our grandchildren are. Common sense makes us think that our children have been assassinated, but that our grandchildren have not. The grandchildren are the disappeared who are still out there, alive and with people who are not their real parents, and with names that are not their real names. These are the people we have to find and rescue in order to give them the freedom that they deserve. That is why we call them the disappeared that live.
Son desaparecidos vivos.
When Patricia Reusenblit was kidnapped all those years ago, she left behind a 15-month-old daughter, Mariana.
Estos son mis padres, José Manuel Pérez Rojo.
These are my parents, José Manuel Pérez Rojo and Patricia Julia Reusenblit.
Propietario de un comercio cuando fueron secuestrados.
My mother was studying medicine, and my father owned a small business when they were both kidnapped on the 6th of October 1978 at the age of 25. In April 2000, one of my colleagues here at the Grandmothers Organization received an anonymous call from someone who talked about a boy who'd been given to an intelligence officer in the Air Force called Francisco Gomez. The caller said that the person had been the son of a medical student who'd been kidnapped and then killed. I decided to go and see the boy, who was now a man. He could not talk because he was busy, so I left him a note with a contact number on it. I also told him who I was, that I was looking for my brother. We talked only briefly, but he was very receptive. That very afternoon, he came back to the office so that he could have the DNA tests and clear up the doubts that he obviously had after he met me. I had found my brother.
Así que cuando encontré el mío con más razón, pero lamentablemente.
Sadly, as soon as I realized that I had found my grandson, I also had to accept that my daughter was gone forever.
Como algo, dos sentimientos encontrados.
In other words, the feeling was bittersweet.
La noticia de que los exámenes inmunogenéticos.
On the one hand, I was overjoyed when the genetic tests on my grandson came back positive.
La cosa fue de gran alegría.
There were lots of tears, shouting and leaping with excitement. However, that moment of euphoria passed, and I felt very sad because I realized there and then that I was never going to find my daughter.
Muy triste al comprobar que, bueno, a mi hija no la voy a encontrar.
Estas dos fotos a mí ya no me dicen nada.
I think of my parents as frozen in time at the age they were in these photos, an age I'm fast approaching. That's really strange. I feel as if these photos no longer tell me anything because I've stared at them so many times, but they're all that's left of the disappeared. It would be nice to find another photo. I've no recollection of my parents, just certain feelings, and these were reactivated when I found my brother. He stirred up feelings for my father especially, because he looks so like him.
Muy parecido a mi papá.
These are the disappeared. And this is the gruesome, painstaking task of trying to locate those missing people. Luis Fondebrida is a forensic anthropologist. Working from whatever records they can find, he and his colleagues locate the last remains of victims of Argentina's years of state terror, dig them up, and try to piece together the story of what happened to them and who they are.
This was on a common grave containing around 40 bodies. Most of them show the same pattern of injuries, these gunshot wounds in the skull. And the important thing was an official version about what happened. The official version say was a confrontation between the guerrillas and the army. I mean, most of our cases we found this kind of injuries, which means people executions.
Not all of these were people who were found in cemeteries. Some of them were people who were washed up on the beach.
There's around 60 bodies from people who were drawn by airplanes to the sea were found in the beaches in Argentina and in Uruguay.
Of the 60 bodies that have been found that were washed up on the sea, how do you know what happened to them?
Normally the hands are tied behind the bodies.
Their hands are tied behind their
behind
backs?
the backs, yeah. They are wearing Argentine clothing. And also we see in some of the cases fractures, which are very common in people falling from some heights, which is typical sign of people at least falling from an airplane could be in this case.
We learned about the death flights, about people being thrown alive from planes. In the beginning, we thought this wasn't true. It's something so horrible that you can live with it, especially if you run the risk of being taken to those planes, right? So you tend to think like people used to think in Nazi concentration camps. No, it's not true. They're being taken to another camp. Or if you live in a ghetto, you used to think, well, they're being transferred to Poland. They're being transferred to another country. It's not true. It couldn't be true. You can live with the belief that they're going to kill you for nothing.
These are some of the alleged terrorists the Argentine military wanted to eliminate. Everyone round this table today knows someone who disappeared. Maybe a close family member, a friend, a comrade. Most spent time in hiding or in prison. They are the lucky ones who survived. Then they were sympathizers or members of a group called the Montoneros. Certainly some of the Montoneros believed in the violent overthrow of society. Many, had they been in Europe, would have simply passed as radicals.
Well, I don't know how you think a revolutionary should look. The fact is that we and many of our comrades came from middle or upper middle class Catholic homes. It is because of this background that we were very sensitive to all the social problems. By the time we were 17, we were already going to villages in order to help the peasants. We were all trying to improve conditions and trying to make our society a little fairer.
Today this country has deep wounds. I think these wounds have affected my children the most. I fear for their future. We feared for our lives, of course. However, now I hope that my children will not have to go through what we went through. I hope that they fight for what they believe in, but I hope that they will be able to confront their enemies on a more equal footing.
We must have done things that were wrong if I analyze them from now. But at that time, I don't think there was another way of achieving our goal or giving everybody in Argentina the right to education, the right to health, the right to having a good job. I don't think we were terrorists at all.
Captain Hector Verges, formerly of the Argentine Army, loves horses. He was once a champion show jumper. Captain Verges was also an interrogator during the Dirty War.
I admit that from time to time we did carry out rather intense interrogations. We did it to people when we needed information quickly. I once heard someone say, a strong interrogation is justified when it saves lives. In other words, a small crime in order to prevent a larger crime. If we follow that notion, I think that strong interrogations are permissible. And I think in times of war, they are justified.
So does Verges admit that he was part of a state terrorist apparatus?
The state has a monopoly on power. The state doesn't commit terrorist acts. The state at that time chose to act in the way that it did, and the people permitted it. The other important forces in the country, the press, the church, the unions, and business, allowed it to happen.
Todas las dirigencias lo consintieron.
Esa metodología criminal.
In my opinion, the criminal methods used by the state were unacceptable, and these methods should be referred to as state terrorism.
Quienes cometieron delitos.
There were very few people who committed abhorrent crimes, war crimes, and crimes against humanity.
Fueron muy pocos.
Argentina's army junta eventually collapsed in 1983, but by then up to 30,000 Argentinians had died at the hands of its forces. When he became head of the army 8 years later, General Martin Balsa apologized on behalf of the army for the Dirty War. But Argentina is still a country suffering from the years of violence.
Que no han cicatrizado. Que no están cerradas.
The wounds are still open. One of the things that is preventing these wounds from healing is the inability to say what happened to the people who disappeared.
El no poder dar respuesta de qué pasó con los desaparecidos.
This question cannot be answered because the Commander-in-Chief of the Army in 1983 ordered all documents that dealt with the war against the subversives to be destroyed before the armed forces handed over power to the democratically elected government. This is why the wounds will take a long time to heal.
Las heridas van a tardar mucho en cicatrizar.
Of my friends before I got kidnapped, almost All of them were killed. My boyfriend, Juan Esteves, he was 20. My two girlfriends, Patricia and Norma, they were 19 and 20, and they were pregnant. Their boyfriends, both of them Eduardo Llorelo and Eduardo Testa, they got killed also. Another girlfriend, Maria Luz, Tito, well, most of them got killed. They were missing. They were too young to die. Too young.
State sponsorship of terror takes many forms, and Iran is all too often still at its heart. In February 2002, the Israeli Defense Force intercepted a ship in the Mediterranean. When they boarded the Karine A, the Israeli sailors found a horde of weapons on their way from Iran to Yasser Arafat's PLO fighters. Proof positive in Israeli eyes, not only of Arafat's continuing commitment to terror, but of Iran's commitment to sponsoring that terror. The serious weapons captured on the Karine A, together with the terror and death caused by Palestinian suicide bombers, convinced Israel's Prime Minister Ariel Sharon that he should launch his own new war on terror. As Israeli tanks crushed all before them, it raised the question of whether Israel was fighting terror with terror.
The trouble with countries that find themselves enmeshed in very violent terrorist campaigns is that often they feel their very survival is at stake. And one of the challenges, I think, in avoiding falling into the trap of human rights violations, of committing acts that in some circumstances might be considered war crimes, is realizing that that's precisely what your opponents are trying to get you to do.
In 1946, modern terrorism was invented by Zionist Jews fighting for a homeland of their own in Palestine. They won their homeland, but now their countrymen are enmeshed in a war against terror more horrific than any could have imagined, a war that threatens to engulf the planet. So what has been learned in the intervening years? For governments weak and strong, the lesson is that when the state uses terror against terrorists, it more often than not fails. It may win each battle, but the state invariably risks losing the war. For the terrorists, too, there is also a clear message. They may attract the world's attention, they may have tactical successes, but terror alone never brings long-term victory. For the rest of us, there is this. While terror will always remain the weapon of the poor and the dispossessed, who have no better substitute, or the fanatical, who can see no further than their cause, it remains the duty of democracies to use ingenuity, not more terror, to fight against it. And while some would have it that all terror is evil and immoral, and should be judged by the nature of the act, rather than the justice of the terrorist's cause, the age of terror has shown us that this is too simple by far. For until it is understood that one man's terrorist truly is another's freedom fighter, there can be no solution to the political and human problem posed by terror.